Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. This 30-minute podcast features a new author interviewed by me every single day, 365 days a year, for about 30 minutes. I am also the publisher for Zibby Books, which publishes 12 books a year in fiction and memoir. Our books are already out now. You can check it out on zibbybooks.com. And we have a magazine called Zibby Mag, where we have lots of wonderful essays and lifestyle features. That's at zibbymag.com. We have classes at zibbyclasses.com. And I recently opened a bookstore in LA called Zibby's Bookshop at 1113 Montana Avenue at 11th Street in Santa Monica. I hope that you are able to enjoy some of our other offerings. But this here podcast is the basis of all of it and started in 2018. And no matter what I do, this is basically my favorite thing. Enjoy. Cassandra Jackson is the author of The Wreck, a daughter's memoir of becoming a mother. Cassandra is a professor of English at the College of New Jersey, where she teaches classes about African American literature and visual culture. She is co-author of the Toni Morrison Book Club and has also published 2 books on race in U.S. literature and art, and she has written about racial oppression in everyday life in HuffPost and the Washington Post. She lives in New Jersey with her husband and 2 children. Welcome, Cassandra. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss The Wreck, a daughter's memoir of becoming a mother.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it so much. I really wanted to do this, so thank you.
Oh no, I'm really glad. And your memoir was, oh my gosh. I mean, all the research that you did and going through all those, like the microfiches and the articles and reconstructing the whole thing. Oh my, anyway, I shouldn't jump right in, but it was so moving. And I honestly I can feel how haunted you are by what happened, because I felt myself just going over it and over it and over it. I don't know. It was really good.
Thank you. And thank you for reading it in that close way where you can also experience some of, sort of what was hanging over me in that moment. I think that was one of the parts of the book that I worried most about, that people would understand that this wasn't, sort of mundane research. You worry that people don't understand sort of how that part fits, and especially as an academic, nobody cares about your research, right? So but that process, right, to me, it was really central to the book because it was so central to understanding myself in a lot of ways. So,
well, let's back up for a minute and tell listeners about your memoir and what it's really about, and then when you decided that this is something that you had to do.
Yeah. So when I think about sort of what this book is about, I really feel like it's about a collision between 2 moments in my life, right? So I'm, 36 years old. I'm trying to get pregnant. I'm not having any success getting pregnant. And it forced me to think so much about legacy, but also experiencing that kind of quiet grief was incredibly familiar to me. And that it was a kind of grief that I had lived with throughout my childhood. And so that moment really took me back to my childhood and a loss that my father experienced before I was born, but that we lived with every day. So before I was born, my father lost his mother, his sister, his sister-in-law, his niece, and his first wife in a car accident. And we did not talk about that accident. We didn't really talk about that part of his life. When I asked questions about, missing relatives, all he would ever say was the wreck. Right? That was the explanation, the wreck. But I didn't have a clear understanding of what had happened, when it happened, where it happened. And yet so much of our lives were determined by that accident, right? I exist because of that accident. And also it was something that I think my family was constantly working very actively and sometimes unconsciously to repress, right? Everything was about, this new life that they had built. And so as I was trying to get pregnant, I found myself reflecting on this grief that has no site for expression. Sort of what do you, especially with, infertility, because it's not like there's some ritual around it, right? It's very much a kind of invisible loss that you're experiencing. And so what this book was really about is sort of what that grief took me to in terms of the other kinds of grief that I had experienced in different parts of my life. And so, yeah, this was my story, but it was also about having to kind of reflect on the past in a way that was really kind of painful. And then asking my dad to engage in that was really hard as well, asking him to reflect on that moment, to tell me about that moment.
My gosh. Well, let's talk about the infertility piece first, because when I read it, like as you laid it out, it seemed like you were swept away and like you were so not treated like a person by the medical establishment. And all these little things, even just them not waiting for these the cysts or whatever to give them their time, or just everything was like, here's what we're doing. There was never a moment where they were like, honey, I think you might be suffering from infertility, and here's what we're going to do. It was like, instead they were like, this is what we're trying, and this, and you've got to get this. And like, I felt like you wrote so well about just being like totally knocked off your feet and being like, wait, what? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, yeah. And if you add to that the fact that you're taking drugs that are making you process and think differently, like I'd be sitting there and with people talking at me and thinking, wow, I smell strange because these drugs are transforming your body in ways that are unimaginable to you. Like I just remember realizing, feeling so swept up in it, but also in reflection, realizing that I was incapable of, sort of fully participating in that process, and no one was asking me to, right? And so, as you said, there was no moment where anybody said, like, you know what, let's sit down and talk about it. I think you're suffering from infertility. Let's talk about, your options, your choices in this moment. It was sort of, this is what you need to be doing. These are the drugs that you need to be taking. And no one really discussed any sort of alternatives with me in a way that would have been helpful. And I felt like my body, was separate from me sometimes in these moments, in the way that, sometimes people describe when they're talking about abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Like I felt like there was some disassociation that was necessary. And in many ways, I had already learned how to do that in women's healthcare, even from the time I was a teenager, those early experiences of going, to a gynecologist where, you endure these often, incredibly invasive procedures. And it's just a given that you're just going to lay there and do it because it's good for you, without any real, conversation about, why you're experiencing this discomfort. And is your discomfort different from someone else's discomfort? There's a moment in the book where I'm talking about this particular doctor because she's ordered a procedure that was very painful. I come back to her and I say, this was really painful. And she kept repeating what I was saying back and editing out the word pain. She kept saying, oh, well, some people experience discomfort. And I'm saying, no. I was screaming on a table in it, experiencing a kind of pain that made me feel out of body. And she keeps saying, yeah, some people experience some discomfort, it was a way in which I felt like I was, being treated very much as, this objectified body that no one was living in at the time. Yeah.
Wow. Even how the codeine that you're like, I'm allergic to codeine. And they're like, no, you probably aren't anymore. And yet next thing you know, you're like vomiting like crazy. I'm like, this poor, like nobody is listening to you,
Yeah. At that particular one with my sensitivity to that particular drug, I've actually had multiple doctors tell me, no, you can take it. You just need to eat more. You can take it. You just need, like, at this point, after you've projectile vomited a half dozen times, you can't take that drug.
Yeah.
And I even had a doctor tell me I needed to take that off of my record very recently. You should just take that off of your record because something could happen and you could really need, and people won't understand. I'm like, it says so much though, I think, about like the way in which healthcare works. I grew up with a mom who she worshiped doctors, You go in, you do what they say. I can remember hearing her on the phone talking about doctors later on, and Dr. So-and-so said, and even my parents would be, when my father became ill later in life, my parents would be very proud of the fact that I could go in and talk to the doctor in a way that made it seem as if me and the doctor were like equals. And it was really, that was like meaningful to them. Like, oh, we have this educated daughter who can talk to the doctor. And quite honestly, like, I think that I imbibed a lot of that. And it's not that I didn't know the ways in which, medicine has treated women, the way in which it's treated people of color. Like, it's not that I didn't understand that, hey, there's a, power differential here. But I think I had imbibed this idea that I could control it. Right. That if I presented myself in a certain way, that if I made myself look like a person with insurance, if I made myself seem like somebody who was educated enough to like understand what they were talking about, that somehow this would skip over me. And, that's why it's called systemic racism, right? Like, if these things are systemic, it's built into the system, it doesn't skip over anybody. And if it does, it's by accident. That's a fluke, right? You don't talk your way out of systemic racism. It doesn't work that way.
Anyway, awful. You tied it really well with sort of the present and the past and all of that pain. And as you're like going through your excruciating, pain-filled current moment, you hear kind of the screeching brakes or whatever of what's going on back in the past, like those screams echoing through that as well. And even the way that you wrote about it slowly, like, here's what happened, but then how you took us through as if we were living through it. Like, and then here's what happened on day one, and here's what happened on day two. And then mama took me aside and told me this, and you have to remember this. And it's like everything kept unfolding. It wasn't just the totality of casualties was this, right? It's like we were there in the hospital with you, not even you weren't there, but with your family, and how you reconstructed that. And even how your aunt didn't even remember it. I mean, all of this stuff I found absolutely fascinating and horrifying, but like they say as a car, how rubbernecking, it's like the book is like one big rubbernecking delay,
Yeah, I feel like is so important to me, that what happened around the accident unfolds in that way, because that's how I experienced it. I learned about it really like a piece at a time. And it took forever for me to even begin to recreate a chronology of what happened, because, in my mind, and remember, this is like a child taking this in when you first hear about the accident. In my mind, there's an accident, poof, everyone dies. Right. And I don't even know who the everyone is, right? I could never keep straight who existed, in that moment, because it's 12 years before I'm born. But as I was sort of learning about it, like one of the early conversations with my father, and he tells me, well, his mother died 10 days later. Right. He keeps saying, well, mama said. And I'm like, well, how did she say anything? Right. And he said, oh, she lived for 10 days. And I think that's when I understood this as a fuller kind of narrative of what happened. That this wasn't something instant. And it was so important for me to frame it that way, because when you think of it as something instant, it's something that doesn't happen in time. And, it's just something that kind of exists without this sort of context. And the context was everything with this accident, right? Because it happens in 1960, and that's critical, right? Because it's still segregated healthcare. Right. And I think that one of the things that it was most shocking to me in my own research was, frankly, how little I knew. Right. I'm supposed to be a professor who, focuses on the history of race in the United States. And I don't think I understood what segregation meant in healthcare on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, if you're in an accident, who comes to get you,
Mm-hmm.
right? You got to wait on the colored ambulance, right? Not every ambulance service is going to service Black people. And if you're living in that context, right, where you are considered so inferior that everything needs to be separate for you,
Mm-hmm.
what happens when you get to a hospital?
Mm-hmm.
How can you trust that you will receive the best care available in that hospital? And I think that I had never, in my mind, they all died at the site of the accident. The idea that there was an aftermath was something that had completely escaped me because no one had ever really talked about what happened. It was always just the wreck, died in the wreck.
And it sounded like, and you don't say this specifically. You're not like, I think the hospital covered something up, but the way that you write the story leads the reader to think, well, like, why did the mom pass away when she was fine for 10 days and then overnight, like, dies, right? Like, what was that? Like, who's not catching something? Was there internal bleeding? Like, were there no extra, like, what was really going on and what could be avoided? What could have been avoided? What losses could have been, reversed?
Yeah. And that will always, sort of be on my mind. But it was certainly something I was thinking about throughout the book because as I'm uncovering, I'm looking at death certificates, I'm looking at these different materials and I'm reading these newspaper articles that really demonstrate how embedded segregation is in this moment, right? Like I can't find, obituaries because you can't publish Black people's obituaries in the same column as white people's
That's
obituaries.
also crazy.
Right. So like, you got to go to a section of the newspaper called News About Negroes in order to find, even find an obituary. And when you see that, it raises certain kinds of questions about what could happen in a hospital with colored signs all over it. What can happen in a hospital with a whites only waiting room? And I think oftentimes when we talk about segregation, we are so often fixated on things like water fountains, because they do demonstrate something about the day to day. But I think that they oftentimes we miss the terror of that, right? Like we miss the idea of walking into a hospital, and it's kind of a given that your life is not as important, right, as the lives of the people around you. And I think that, I do find it hard to believe that in a situation where you're rushed to an emergency room in Alabama in 1960, that your care would be a priority as a Black person in that moment. So I do find it hard to believe. And I think that if they miss something that, I think some of it was probably just kind of careless disregard, in a way that, because, even the newspaper articles, when they're listing the names of the victims, right? And all the white names have to be at the top and they have to say Mr. and Mrs. and the Black names are just listed at the bottom and behind them, Negro, right? And so, there would have been no consequences for missing something, right? There would have been no real impact. Right, for not treating, Black people in the same ways that they would have treated a white person in that hospital.
Well, it makes it clear that there's all this talk about inherited trauma, right? And there is such a huge trauma that you have inherited. I mean, how does any family sort of, pull themselves upright after something like this has happened, especially when it pervaded so many branches, right? Like so many pieces of history. And then here you come, and like, how do you make sense of it, right? How do you integrate all this information? So how did writing the whole story and digging deep and finding out all these facts, like, how do you make sense of it all now? Like, how do you think about it? Like sort of not repackaging, sort of like, rewriting your own sort of narrative after changing some of the past that wasn't quite in order?
That's a great question. I feel like I have so many more tools at my disposal than my dad had at that time. Like, I don't know if my father could have done anything other than what he did. right? And I think that one of the things that he was trying to do in some ways is he was trying to go on with his life, but he was also trying to, reproduce, like to recreate an idea of family, and yet still being haunted by the past. And I too have been haunted, and I'm not sure if you so much had this moment where you've made sense of it as I've had periods in which different moments include different kinds of healing given the ways in which it comes to me. So I guess what I mean by that is that I feel like there are ways in which I am always working through the significance of that past to this moment now. And, I'm always planning for disaster, for example. Like I'm always planning for disaster. I'm like, I don't have a bomb shelter or anything. It's not that. In my mind, I'm planning for it because you can't control it. Right. This idea, right, that these, devastating losses are part of our lives in ways that we don't necessarily have control over. But I've had to like temper that because, my husband likes to talk about the fact that like I will point to a disaster and tell someone really you should be careful because, and then I'll go into this horrible story of someone being dismembered by something usually, and he will say, "You do realize other people do not talk like this." And I know that that's coming from a place of loss, right? And so I think that I don't know if I so much make sense of it as I give myself the space to process it, to let it come to me when it comes to me, and to process that grief. And I do think there is something to what my father did, which was really kind of a kind of recreation of family and moving on and taking real pleasure and delight in that. And I think that's something that I do as well. But yeah, it's always sort of in progress. I don't think it's ever finite. But I know for me, one of the things that was really important was the knowing. And I know that some things could not be recreated, right? Like there are some things that remain unknowns, but it was really important to me that I gathered the information and that it would be there for my children when they needed to know more, because like so much of my life was so much about like the secrecy of family, just family secrets and the things that you don't talk about. And I wanted to create a space where I could not only talk about it and process it out loud and process it as a writer, but also to create a space for my children to be able to process it, because I don't think it's a kind of loss that has like some sort of final ending. Like it is deeply embedded in who we are.
So true. Tell me about the process of writing the book and when you fit that in with your with your motherhood and life and work, and like when did you do all of this and how did you get it done?
I feel like I should ask you the same question.
Maybe that's why I'm asking you. I'm like, advice,
right? Yeah, when do we get it done? So with this book, I remember writing pieces of this soon after I had my first child, and she was nursing a lot, like not just a little bit. Like she was a kid who nursed all night, it seemed like. And I can remember just being up at night and literally like feed the baby, put her down, write a little bit, feed the baby, put her down, write a little bit. There wasn't a lot of sleep in there anyway. And I figured, I needed to write it down too. Like there was something therapeutic about that process, I'm sure, but I felt so compelled to be writing about this. So there was that, but it took a long time. I had, 2 children, and, there were times in the process where I'm like, I don't know. I just didn't know if it was a book, and I kept looking at it. I was thinking, it's really 2 stories. It's not one story, but I can't tell one story without the other story because they're so connected in these, intimate ways for me. And so some of the writing took place in the wee hours. And then in later years, even as my kids were getting even a little bit older, I would still get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and write really, really early. And I look back at that now and I'm like, how did I do that? Like you just think like, well, that should have, been torture going without sleep. And I don't necessarily recommend writing that way, but I think that when you got to be up before they're up, right? With the kids, like you got to be up before they're up anyway. But yeah, it also took a long time to find the form. I tried to read as many memoirs as I could that really like broke the rules because I didn't know how I could make these stories fit together in terms of the form. And I was obsessed with it because I do feel like form is like a kind of the place where I feel most vulnerable as a writer. Like it's the thing I worry about the most, the form. Like, is this going to make sense to anybody but me? And it wasn't until I found the form that all of those pieces I had been writing for so long started to fall into place, or I would kind of nudge them into place to try to make it work as a book. But yeah, I'm an everyday writer, or at least I try to be an everyday writer, right? But what I've discovered is like with little kids, like, talk about not being able to control anything. Like, and, they get sick. Like they get sick all the time. Like they get, they have needs that need to be met that definitely make it hard sometimes to find the time to actually write. Yeah, it was tricky. And it took way longer than I thought this book was going to take. I know everyone says that, but like it took way longer than I thought this book was going to take. And part of it is that I started this book at a time where I then subsequently had 2 children after it. So I had this conversation a long time ago with the poet Claudia Rankin, and it really helped me deal with how long this book took. I was having dinner with her one night when she was visiting this area. And I don't really know her. I was just invited to this dinner, and I asked her a similar kind of question about how did she get Citizen done. And she talked about the time it took her between books. And then she mentioned the age of her child. And she said, you do notice that those are the same. Oh. Like it took her, she was like, my kid had to get old enough for me to get the space to actually do this, to finish this. And I just thought, wow, that's so helpful because when you're talking to somebody, you're like, oh, there's a literary genius. And they're telling you, oh no, it's hard to write with children. Things take longer with kids. It was so helpful to me because honestly, I think I actually felt like a little bit of shame about how long this book took me.
Okay, how long did it really take?
I think I worked on this book for 10 years.
Okay.
I think I worked on this book for 10 years because it was, and that's not including when the book finally gets picked up and there were edits to do after that. So yeah, I want to say it was like, a 10-year period of time. I got other books out during that time, but not this book. Yeah, because I started this book right after I had published a scholarly book and then published a book with some friends in between while I was still working on this one. And then, it took some time.
Well, it's not...
You know the deal.
I know the deal. I know the deal. But I also feel like this book is so important for you and your family. And like, it's not like you're just cranking out a novel about a car crash even. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is so...
Yep.
There's a lot of stuff there. So I feel like how great that you just got it. You did it though. And now it's done.
Yeah. Yeah. And I honestly think one of the reasons I couldn't finish it was in part because, some of the stories of the people in it weren't finished yet in a way that I needed to happen in order for me to really understand the meaning of their lives in a way. And I think that was one of the things that was also making this book hard because I didn't have answers to all the questions that I was really posing in this book. And I was asking big questions about, survival, asking huge questions about how people survive something like what my father survived. And I think that, it took real reflection and time and spending time with people There were relatives in the book that I had never really had conversations with about this either, because we'd all been taught not to talk about it. And I was stunned when you mentioned earlier when I go and talk to my cousin who was in the accident, and she tells me she doesn't remember it, and it was stunning to me that it was as if, the not talking in some ways for me, it required a book to break through that kind of silence.
Wow. Well, look, you got it done. It's great. You still kept everything else in the air enough that, so I think it's wonderful. And I really do feel like this book, a lot of it is about your search for control over all these things that were just out of grasp. And so hopefully, even though it took a while, the fact that you took it back makes you feel empowered going forward with all the other stuff,
It does. It really, really does.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're awesome. I really appreciate you doing this. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Cassandra. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.